The sun was already setting, casting a fiery orange glow across the barren, dust-choked landscape of Devil's Canyon. From the high ridge, Jim Callahan watched the five riders disappear into the winding depths below, the sound of their horses' hooves muffled by the canyon's vast silence. He didn't need to see them to know what was happening. He'd heard Sarah's scream, sharp and terrified, echo off the canyon walls, fading into the dark like a ghost lost in the wind. Five men, faces hidden, riding fast, dragging her behind them like she was nothing more than a sack of grain. Sarah Hris, beautiful, strong, the only woman in this godforsaken territory who had ever looked at him as something more than a killer for hire. Her scream had torn through his chest like a bullet, and now, as he stood frozen on the edge of the ridge, the fire of vengeance lit his soul. There was no more time to think. He had to move, had to act, or she would be gone by morning. Jim spurred his horse forward, heading straight for the heart of hell itself. The canyon had claimed more than its share of lives, and tonight it would try to take another. But this time, Jim wasn't running from it. He was going in, alone, with only a rifle and a promise to keep. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in blood-orange hues, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. A single rider cut through the dust, his horse's hooves kicking up clouds of red earth, each step taking him closer to a place no man in his right mind would dare go after dark, Devil's Canyon. He had no choice. He had heard Sarah's screams in his bones, echoing against the canyon walls, a sound that had haunted him for the last few hours. It was a sound he could never unhear, a sound that had driven him beyond reason. Jim Callahan wasn't a fool. He knew the risks. The canyon was a death trap, a place where men disappeared without a trace, swallowed by the jagged rocks and dark crevices. But tonight wasn't just the canyon he feared. It was what lay inside it, waiting for him. Sarah Hris was waiting for him. The only woman who'd ever seen past his rough edges. The only one who'd ever made him believe he could be something more than the bounty hunter the world knew him as. He had seen things in his life, things that had stripped the humanity from him, turned him into a ghost of the man he once was. Gunfights, betrayal, loss. But this was different. This was personal. He could still see her face, the way she had looked at him in church last Sunday, her hand brushing his as she passed him the hymn book. For a moment, there had been no walls between them, no weight of their worlds pressing down. There had only been the unspoken promise of something real, something tender in a place that knew nothing but cruelty. But now, all that remained was the sound of her voice, faint and desperate, calling his name from somewhere deep in the canyon. His hands tightened on the reins, his heart hammering in his chest. This was no simple rescue. He knew what Cole's men were capable of. He had seen their handiwork before. They didn't just kill, they tortured, they broke. And he couldn't let that happen to her. The wind howled through the canyon walls, carrying with it the scent of burning wood and sweat, mixing with the bitter tang of metal in the air. The sky above was turning ink black as night swallowed the land whole, and Jim's horse fought against the pull of the reins, sensing the danger. But Jim didn't hesitate. He spurred the animal forward, crossing into the shadow of the canyon, where death waited in every corner. As the canyon swallowed them whole, the only sounds were the echo of the horse's hooves and the distant murmur of the wind. Then, just as Jim was starting to lose himself in the endless maze of rock, he heard it, a scream, sharp and agonizing. Sarah's scream. It sent a chill through his spine, freezing him to the bone. It was close, too close. He pushed the horse harder, the beast struggling beneath him as they moved deeper into the canyon. The narrow passage was treacherous, each step a risk. Loose rocks skittered underfoot, threatening to send them both tumbling into the abyss below. But Jim didn't slow down. He couldn't. Every second he spent hesitating could be the difference between life and death for Sarah. The sound of her scream faded, but it left a hole in his gut, a hole that only grew wider as he pressed on. It was a trap. He had to be sure it was a trap. Cole had been planning this for months, maybe longer. It wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. It was personal. And Jim knew, with the certainty of a man who had lived through too many betrayals, that this wasn't the end of the story. This was just the beginning. As the canyon walls rose higher around him, the darkness thickened, swallowing the path ahead. There were no stars above, no moon to guide him. Only shadows. Only the twisted whispers of a canyon that had claimed the lives of countless souls. His rifle was ready at his side, his fingers trembling slightly as he checked it once more. He wasn't just hunting a man tonight. He was hunting a monster. And as he moved further into the maze of red rock, he realized with a cold certainty that this was the final ride. The one that would either redeem him or bury him in the dust like so many before him. The trail ahead split in 3 directions, like the tongues of a serpent, each path winding deeper into the heart of the canyon. Jim dismounted, his boots crunching against the dry earth as he scanned the ground. The moonlight barely touched the canyon floor, leaving everything shrouded in shadow. But even in the dim light, Jim could see the signs, the faintest imprints of hoof prints in the dust. 8 horses, not 5. His stomach twisted. This wasn't a simple raid. This was a carefully planned operation. His mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place as he crouched to examine the prints. Cole's men hadn't just taken Sarah. They made sure to leave enough clues to lead him into the heart of the trap. He didn't need to be a tracker to know that. The hoof prints told the story, loud and clear. They were leading him in a direction he didn't want to follow, down a path that would take him into the very jaws of hell. Jim's hand tightened around the rifle, his fingers brushing the cold steel. He could feel the weight of the weapon, the memories of countless men he had killed in cold blood. But none of those kills had felt like this. This wasn't about bounty. This wasn't about survival. This was personal. And no matter how many men he had to face, he wasn't going to stop until he found Sarah and made them pay for what they'd done. He stood up, his legs stiff as he moved to the next set of tracks. They split off from the main trail and led down a narrow path to the right. Jim hesitated. Something felt off about the whole situation. He'd been around enough outlaws to know when they were trying to outthink him. And right now, he had the distinct feeling that Cole was one step ahead. He wasn't just after Sarah. He was after something much bigger. Jim's gut told him to take the right path, the one that didn't seem to make sense. That's the one where the truth would be hiding. The one where he might find Sarah before it was too late. He spurred his horse forward, the animal snorting and stamping as it resisted, sensing the danger that lay ahead. But Jim forced it on, the weight of his responsibility pushing him forward like a second skin. The path grew narrower, the rock walls closing in around him. The air was thick with the scent of dust and sweat, the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional drip of water from the canyon's jagged peaks. There was no wind here, no sound of birds or animals, just the uneasy echo of his own heartbeat and the soft rhythm of the horse's hooves. After what felt like an eternity, Jim spotted something on the ground. It was a scrap of blue fabric caught in the jagged branches of a mesquite tree. His heart skipped a beat. He recognized that fabric. It was from Sarah's dress, the one she'd worn at church just a few days ago. The realization hit him like a gut punch. She had been here, on this path, and whoever had taken her had made sure to leave a trail behind them. Jim crouched, his breath steady as he examined the fabric. This wasn't just some random cloth caught on a branch. This was a message meant for him. His fingers brushed the torn edge, and he felt a cold chill run through his spine. They knew he was following. They wanted him to follow. This was all a game to them, a game where Sarah's life was the prize. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to regroup, and take a more cautious approach. But he couldn't. Not now. Not when he was so close. The trail led him further down the canyon, deeper into the maze of stone and shadow. The walls rose up on either side, towering like sentinels, blocking out the last remnants of daylight. He could feel the weight of the canyon pressing down on him, a sense of being trapped, cornered. But he pressed on, each step taking him closer to the heart of the darkness. And then he heard it. The faintest sound, a whisper almost lost in the wind. A woman's scream. sharp, desperate, and unmistakably Sarah's. It was the kind of scream that cut through you like a knife to the soul. It was the sound of a woman on the brink of despair, of a person who had reached the end of their endurance. Jim's heart thundered in his chest as he urged his horse forward, faster now, desperation clouding his thoughts. He didn't care about the trap anymore. He didn't care about the men waiting in the shadows. All that mattered was Sarah. He had to get to her. The path ahead narrowed even further, the rocks scraping against the sides of his horse, forcing it to move more carefully. Jim's grip on the reins tightened. Every inch of him was on edge. The shadows seemed to deepen, the air colder, as though the canyon itself was alive, breathing in the silence of the night. He was almost there. And then, as if the world had decided to close its doors on him, the canyon walls opened up into a small clearing. The sight of it stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't the canyon he'd expected. It wasn't the darkness he had imagined. No, this was something worse. The clearing was bathed in the flickering glow of campfires, their light casting long shadows over the scattered figures of men. There were more of them than he had anticipated, at least a dozen, maybe more. And in the center of their camp, standing like a cruel monument to the death and suffering that had taken place here, was a wooden cage. Inside, a woman sat, her long dark hair hiding her face, her shoulders slumped in exhaustion. Jim's blood turned to ice. It wasn't Sarah. It was Maria Santos. The same Maria Santos who had been buried just days ago in Silver Falls. And there she was alive, trapped, caged. Cole wasn't just taking women. He was keeping them. He was playing a game of his own, one where the rules didn't matter, where lives were nothing more than pawns to be moved around at his whim. And now, Jim realized with a sickening clarity, he wasn't just hunting a man. He was hunting a monster. The sight of Maria, alive and caged, twisted something deep inside Jim. His mind raced, scrambling to make sense of it, but the truth was undeniable. He had seen death in every form, but never like this. The woman who had been buried in Silver Falls, mourned by her family, was now sitting before him, alive, but a prisoner of Marcus Cole's twisted empire. Maria's dark eyes lifted, catching Jim's gaze. There was no hope in them, only the haunting silence of someone who had long ago given up on ever seeing freedom again. But her recognition of him, the faintest flicker of understanding, was enough to break his heart. Behind her cage, Cole's men moved like shadows, their faces hard and expressionless. They had been expecting him, it seemed. His presence, as much as it had been an obstacle, was now part of their game. A game where everyone played their part, except the innocent. And the innocent were the ones who paid the price. Jim's instinct screamed at him to do something, anything, to rescue Maria, but he couldn't. Not yet. Not with so many armed men surrounding the camp. Charging him would get him killed, and worse, it would put Maria and Sarah, whoever she was, wherever she was, at risk. His hands itched for the cold steel of his gun, but he knew that pulling it too soon would be the end of them all. Instead, he crouched low behind a boulder, his heart pounding in his chest. From this angle, he could see the whole camp, the men moving in lazy circles, unaware of the hunter in their midst. The fires crackled, sending sparks dancing into the night sky. The smell of smoke filled the air, mixing with the sharp scent of sweat and gunpowder. He could feel the heat of the flames against his face, the crackling embers biting at the edges of his resolve. Maria's cage was a centerpiece of this nightmarish tableau. It stood at the heart of their camp, a twisted mockery of a prisoner's holding pen. Jim's eyes flicked from her to the campfires, then back to the men. He had to be careful. Every step he took could be his last. They were organized, too organized. Cole's military background was evident in the way his men moved, the way they positioned themselves, anticipating every threat. Jim couldn't take them all on. He wasn't sure what had made him stay back. Maybe it was the fear of walking into a trap. Maybe it was the way the camp was so meticulously planned, like it had been set up for a man like him to come looking for trouble. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, something stirred inside him. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about stopping the monster behind this madness. The firelight flickered in the distance, casting long, ghostly shadows across the canyon walls. And then, just as he was considering making his move, he heard a voice. Low, cold, calculating. Well, look who finally made it. The voice was familiar, too familiar. Jim didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The man who had been the devil in his past was now the devil standing before him. Marcus Cole. The bastard had aged since the last time they'd met. His once dark hair was streaked with gray, and his face was carved with deep lines of age and bitterness. His eyes, however, were as cold and calculating as ever. Jim could almost feel the weight of the gun that Cole had surely at his side, waiting for the right moment to pull it. You should have stayed away, Jim, Cole continued, his voice dripping with malice. This ain't your fight anymore. You've lost before you even drew your gun. Jim didn't flinch. He didn't need to. He had already fought men like Cole. He'd fought men who thought they could control the lives of others with nothing more than greed and fear. But what Cole didn't understand was that Jim had already lost everything he cared about. He didn't fear death anymore. He feared living with the memory of his failure. You're the one who's lost, Marcus, Jim said, his voice steady, the weight of the words carrying like the echo of a gunshot. You've taken everything. You've taken lives, you've taken women, but you'll never take what matters most. Not from me. Cole let out a low laugh, the sound sharp and cruel. Oh, Jim, you still don't get it, do you? You think this is about some moral code, some sense of justice? This is bigger than you, bigger than any of us. We're in a world where men like you and I don't survive. Not unless we play the game, not unless we bend the rules. And you, Jim, you've got too much honor for that. Jim's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly stood, his eyes never leaving Cole's. You may be right. I may not play your game, but you'll regret that mistake before the sun rises. Marcus' eyes darkened, the corners of his mouth curling into a grim smile. We'll see, Jim. We'll see. The men behind him stiffened at the words, weapons shifting in the firelight, their eyes turning toward the bounty hunter who had walked straight into their camp. Cole's grin widened. He knew what Jim had come for. He knew what Jim was willing to risk. And Jim knew, too. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and far from any help. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the pressure mounting as the air grew thick with the scent of danger. The only thing he had left was his will, and that, he knew, was all he needed. The moonlight above caught a glint in Maria's eyes, a silent plea. She was still alive, but for how long? In the distance, Jim could hear a woman scream again, faint and desperate. It wasn't Sarah. He had no doubt about it now. This was a different scream. It was the sound of a woman on the edge of despair. And that scream pushed Jim over the edge. This wasn't just about saving one life anymore. This was about stopping Cole, stopping the monster, once and for all. The tension in the air was palpable, thick as the smoke rising from the campfires. Jim stood like a statue, every muscle in his body coiled tight, ready to snap at any moment. He could feel the weight of the rifle in his hands, a familiar comfort in this uncertain hellhole. But the world around him had shifted. There was no turning back now. The choice had already been made, and in that moment, Jim was ready to face whatever hell awaited him. Cole hadn't moved, still standing with that twisted grin on his face, as if the whole world were his to control. You know, Jim, he said, stepping closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. I've been thinking about this for a long time, about the way things were supposed to go. He tilted his head, eyes glinting under the moonlight. You were supposed to be dead by now. It was supposed to be easy. I figured you'd show up, all alone, all noble, ready to save the girl. And I'd just send you to join your old friends. Simple. Jim didn't flinch, didn't even blink. You underestimated me, Marcus. You always did. Oh, I knew you'd be trouble, Cole said, his voice dripping with arrogance. That's why I made sure to plan for you. That's why we're here. You came looking for her. You came because you thought you could save her. But what you don't understand is that Sarah isn't the prize. Not anymore. She was just part of the game. Jim's gaze hardened. He didn't need to hear anymore. He had already heard enough to understand the nightmare Cole had created. Sarah had been more than a pawn in his game. She'd been a willing player, driven by something darker than just survival. Betrayal ran deeper than he had realized, deeper than he could have ever imagined. "I've known men like you my whole life, Marcus," Jim said, his voice low and calm, as if he were speaking to a ghost. "And every one of them ended up the same way, dead, forgotten, a memory rotting in the ground. You think you're untouchable. You think you've won. But you haven't." Marcus laughed, a low, hollow sound. "You think I care about your little ideals? Your sense of right and wrong? Look around, Jim. This is the real world. And in the real world, you do what you have to do to survive. You take what you want, and you make sure no one can take it from you. That's how the game is played." The flames flickered higher, the heat from the fire scorching Jim's skin. But it wasn't the fire that burned him. It was the betrayal, the realization of just how deep Sarah's involvement ran. His heart pounded, fury and confusion boiling within him. How could she have lied to him? How could she have been a part of this? He had been so sure. So damn sure. And now, everything he thought he knew had been turned upside down. In the distance, a faint cry cut through the air, a sharp, guttural sound of pain. The voice was unmistakable. It was Sarah. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. She wasn't just playing along with Cole's game. She had become a part of it, a willing player. And now, every ounce of his trust had been shattered. He turned toward the campfires. His heart ached as he saw Maria's cage, the woman who had been taken long before Sarah. But this time, Maria wasn't looking at him with hope. She wasn't the same girl who had looked at him in desperation. No, now there was something else in her eyes, something dark, something resigned. "She knew," Jim murmured, as the truth sank in. "She knew all along." Cole grinned. "Oh, I see you're starting to put it together, Jim. That's the beauty of the game. Everyone has their role. Maria here, she knew. She did exactly what I asked. And Sarah, well, Sarah's been playing her own game. But now it's too late for her. Too late for both of them." Maria's eyes flicked to him, the pain in them raw, but there was no fear. Only the exhaustion of knowing that whatever game Cole had been playing, it was a game no one could win. And now, they were all trapped in it. Cole's men shifted nervously, their guns never leaving their hands. Jim counted them silently. 15 men, all armed, all positioned carefully around the camp, each with his own job to do. But for all their planning, for all their careful strategy, they had forgotten one thing. They had underestimated him. And in doing so, they had made their fatal mistake. The firelight danced across the canyon, casting long, erratic shadows, as if the canyon itself was alive, watching them all. Jim knew it was now or never. If he didn't act soon, they would all die in this hellhole. His hand tightened on the rifle. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to move, to end this, to put an end to Marcus Cole's reign of terror once and for all. But he had to be smart. He couldn't just charge in and hope for the best. The canyon was too treacherous, the men too numerous. He needed a plan, and he needed time. "I'm not here to play your game, Marcus," Jim said, his voice like steel. "I'm here to end it." Cole stepped forward, his grin widening. "You don't have the strength, Jim. You never did. That's why you're out here alone. You're a relic of a bygone time. You won't survive this." He motioned to the men behind him. "Take him." Jim didn't move. Not yet. But his mind was working, calculating the next move. He couldn't afford to hesitate. He had to move, and he had to do it now. And then, as if the world had finally decided to give him the chance he needed, Maria made her move. With a swift, desperate motion, she grabbed a burning branch from the campfire, the flame licking at the dry brush nearby. The fire spread quickly, catching the brush and dry grass on the canyon walls. Within seconds, the camp was engulfed in a wildfire, a wall of flames cutting off any chance of escape. The men froze, unsure of what to do. The fire was too fast, too overwhelming. The heat was intense, the smoke choking them. And in the chaos, Jim took his chance. Chaos erupted. The flames that Maria had set to scatter the men's focus now roared through the canyon like a beast unleashed, licking the dry earth and crackling through the brittle brush. The air was thick with smoke and heat, the pungent smell of burning wood mixing with the acrid tang of sweat and gunpowder. The fire was wild, racing up the canyon walls, cutting off escape routes, turning the once calm night into a hellscape of glowing red and orange. For a moment, everyone seemed to freeze. Cole, his men, and Jim. The fire's sudden ferocity had caught them off guard. The wind carried it faster than anyone had anticipated, sending it roaring across the brush and into the heart of their camp. A dozen men scrambled, shouting orders, trying to organize a defense against a fire that couldn't be contained. But in the confusion, everything fell apart. Jim didn't hesitate. In the split second of hesitation that followed the first rush of panic, he moved, quick and lethal. His hands were already on his rifle, swinging it up to his shoulder, the stock settling against his cheek as he found his first target in the midst of the confusion. The first shot rang out, sharp and decisive. One of Cole's men fell to the ground, his body jerking in the firelight before it collapsed into the dirt. The sound of gunfire was deafening, echoed by the flames that crackled through the night, consuming everything in its path. It wasn't just the fire that was killing them now. It was the bullet, the final strike in a war that had been building for too long. Cole's men scattered, tried to return fire, but their aim was off, rattled by the fire, distracted by the chaos. Jim moved swiftly, a shadow among shadows, darting behind the burning wreckage of the camp, using the flames as cover. His movements were methodical, deliberate, as his rifle barked again and again, dropping another man with each pull of the trigger. But he couldn't afford to waste time. He had to find Sarah. The heat from the fire was unbearable now, a wall of oppressive heat that pushed him forward, even as the smoke choked his lungs and the air seemed to thicken with each breath. He pushed through it, moving toward the far side of the camp where he had last seen Sarah. He needed to find her before it was too late. As he crept along the edge of the flames, he saw Maria, her figure a shadow against the firelight, making her way toward the center of the camp, where the largest tent stood. She was moving quickly, but her steps were measured, careful. She wasn't running in fear like the others. No, she had a purpose. Jim followed, his heart pounding in his chest, the sound of the fire and his own breathing drowning out everything else. He kept his eyes on Maria, watching her every move. She wasn't afraid anymore. The cage, the betrayal, everything that had kept her bound, she had shed it all in the face of this firestorm. Now, she was as much a part of the reckoning as he was. The tent loomed ahead, its flaps flapping wildly in the heat, the firelight casting strange shadows on its canvas walls. Jim's mind raced as he neared it, every instinct telling him that Sarah was inside. He could hear voices, muffled by the sound of the flames, and his blood ran cold. One voice was unmistakable. Sarah. But it wasn't the same voice he remembered. There was no warmth in it now, no trace of the woman who had once cared for him. Now, her voice was sharp, cold, a woman who had been changed, broken, or perhaps always lost. Jim ducked low, staying out of sight as he approached the tent. He could hear footsteps behind him, the sound of men regrouping, trying to circle around. But none of them saw him. He was a ghost now, as invisible as the wind that howled through the canyon, only visible in the flash of gunfire and the sharp reports of his rifle. He reached the tent, his heart thumping in his chest. The fire was growing faster than anyone could have predicted. He didn't have much time. He pushed the flap aside, stepping inside. The air was thick with smoke and a sharp, metallic scent of sweat. And there she was, Sarah. Her back was to him, her hands clasped behind her, her posture straight, as if she had been waiting for him. For a moment, Jim thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, but it was gone before he could be sure. She wasn't afraid of him, but she wasn't glad to see him, either. She was resigned. "You came," she said, her voice distant, almost detached, as if she were speaking from a place far away. She didn't turn to face him, didn't move a muscle. "I had to," Jim replied, his voice thick with emotion. He could barely speak over the choking smoke, but he had to say it. He had to say it to make sense of everything. I couldn't just leave you to this. She laughed softly, bitterly, shaking her head. You think I didn't know that? She finally turned to face him, her eyes hard as steel, but there was something behind them, something broken. I knew you'd come. I knew you'd try to save me. But you don't get it, Jim. It's too late. Too late for what? His voice rose in frustration, his heart heavy with betrayal. What are you talking about? Everything, she said quietly, stepping back, her gaze never leaving him. You should have stayed away. All of you. We're all just pawns in a bigger game, Jim. Cole's game. My father's game. You never had a chance. I never had a chance. None of us did. Her words struck him like a hammer. Every ounce of trust he had placed in her, the smiles, the kindness, the letters, was now shattered. He didn't know her anymore. The woman who had cared for him, who had been a light in the darkness, had become someone else entirely. And yet, in the depths of his heart, he could feel the twinge of regret. Not for her betrayal, but for his own. Because, despite everything, despite the lies, despite the fire and death, a part of him still wanted to save her. But she wasn't the woman he had once known. Sarah stood there, her expression unreadable. You came because you thought there was still something left, she said softly. But it's over, Jim. There's nothing left. Not for me. Not for you. Jim's heart was heavy as he took a step forward, the weight of the past, the weight of everything he had lost, settling on his shoulders. He had no choice now, not just for himself, but for the others. For Maria, for the women who had been lost. He lifted his rifle. The time for saving was over. The time for reckoning had come. Sarah's words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating, settling into the cracks between them. Jim stood still, the weight of her betrayal heavy on his chest, his hands shaking as he lowered his rifle. But he couldn't just let it end here. He couldn't allow the fire, the blood, and the heartache to have been for nothing. I'm not leaving you behind, Sarah, he said, his voice raw but firm. Not like this. She met his gaze, her eyes empty and cold, as if she had already died inside. You don't understand, she whispered, stepping back, her body tense, her face unreadable. There's nothing left for either of us. Marcus, he's won. He's taken everything from me, and I've let him. I've been part of it all, Jim. The lies, the schemes. I'm just as guilty as he is. The fire crackled outside, the flames roaring in a frenzy, a symbol of the chaos that had engulfed them all. Jim's chest tightened as the words sank in. There was no saving Sarah now. He had to accept that. And yet, the urge to reach out, to pull her from the depths of her own darkness, gnawed at him. She had been his light in the dust of this barren world, the one who had seen him. Not the bounty hunter, not the man of violence, but the man he could have been, the man he wanted to be. But she had already chosen her path, and it wasn't a path he could follow. I can't save you from yourself, Sarah, Jim said, his voice soft but resolute. But I can stop Cole. I can end this madness. And you'll have to face what you've done. Her eyes flickered with something, a momentary spark of emotion, pain, regret, or maybe something else entirely. You'll never stop him, Jim, she said, her voice almost a plea. Even if you kill him, even if you kill all of us, there's always someone else. Someone more powerful, someone richer. Men like Cole, they don't die. They just keep coming. I don't care anymore, Jim replied, his voice growing harder, colder. This ends tonight. With that, he turned and stepped toward the tent flap, his hand clutching the rifle. The men outside had begun to regroup, but they were disoriented, caught between the spreading fire and the chaos of the night. Jim had seen men die in all manner of ways, but this was different. This wasn't a fight for survival. This was a fight for something else, for justice, for redemption. And if he died tonight, he would die knowing he had done the right thing. He stepped into the night, the flames licking the air behind him, the heat pressing against his back. The canyon had become a maze of smoke and shadow, the fire dancing across the rocks like vengeful spirits. He couldn't see Cole or his men, at least not yet. But he could hear them, the gruff voices, the shuffling of boots, the metallic clink of weapons being drawn. And then, From the smoke, he saw them. A handful of figures moving quickly, heading toward him with weapons raised. Their faces were barely visible, hidden behind the soot and smoke, but Jim knew them. He knew the type. They were Cole's men, and they were coming for him. Without hesitation, Jim raised his rifle and took the first shot. The crack of the rifle echoed through the canyon, followed by the thud of a body hitting the dirt. The other men faltered, hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Jim moved quickly, dropping to the ground, rolling behind a large boulder that jutted out from the canyon wall. Gunfire erupted all around him, the bullets splintering the rocks near his head. He didn't flinch. He didn't have time to. He popped up behind the boulder, aimed, and fired again, dropping another man with a single shot. The fire crackled behind him, the flames casting long, unnatural shadows as the smoke thickened, making it harder to see. The canyon had become a war zone, every shadow a potential enemy. The sound of gunfire was deafening, the crack of rifles blending with the roar of the flames, a symphony of death and destruction. Jim kept moving, his mind sharp, his senses heightened. This wasn't a battle for survival anymore. This was a battle to end it all, to end the cycle of violence that had plagued him and so many others for far too long. He saw Cole then, emerging from the smoke, his face grim, his hands gripping a rifle as he scanned the surroundings. Jim's heart skipped a beat. The moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived. He was face to face with the man who had caused all of this, the man who had manipulated lives like pawns on a chessboard. "Jim," Cole said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've made it this far, but it's over. You can't win. You've already lost, Marcus," Jim said, his voice cold and steady. "This ends tonight. You're not getting away this time." Cole chuckled darkly, his eyes glinting with malice. "You really think that, don't you?" He raised his rifle, aiming it straight at Jim. "You think you can stop me? You think you can kill me and make everything right? There are bigger forces at play here, Jim. Forces you'll never understand." Jim didn't wait for him to finish. He fired first. The shot rang out, echoing through the canyon, a sharp crack of finality. But it wasn't enough. The bullet grazed Cole's arm, sending him stumbling backward. He fired in return, but his shot missed by a wide margin. Jim didn't hesitate. He took cover behind another rock, the firelight flickering around him as he repositioned himself. His breath was heavy, but his hands were steady. This was it. This was the moment that would define everything. Another shot rang out, and Cole dropped to the ground, clutching his chest, his eyes wide in shock. The firelight flickered in his pupils, a final reflection of the chaos he had caused. Jim approached slowly, his rifle aimed at Cole's chest. There was no more need for words, no more need for explanations. This was the end of the line. "You're done," Jim said, his voice unwavering. Cole gasped for air, blood oozing from the wound. "You don't understand." His voice trailed off, the words caught in his throat. Jim stood over him, his face hard as stone. "I understand enough," he muttered. And with that, he pulled the trigger, ending the nightmare once and for all. The fire raged behind him, but Jim didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The flames would burn out, just as the lives of men like Marcus Cole always did, quick, violent, and with no one left to remember them. The canyon was silent now, save for the crackling of the dying fire and the distant sound of horses galloping off into the night. The battle was over, but the cost had been high. The canyon was still burning. Jim stood at the edge of the smoldering camp, his back to the fire, his heart heavy with a weight he couldn't shake. The flames twisted in the wind, licking the canyon walls like a living thing, consuming everything in its path. The men he had killed, the fire he had fought against, the betrayal he had suffered, it all felt like a blur now. A nightmare that had no end, no redemption, only the slow burn of what had been lost. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, the smoke thick in his lungs, the grit of the world clinging to his skin. For a moment, he let himself breathe, let the silence of the canyon wash over him, like a wave pulling him down into the depths. The fire still crackled, but its roar had quieted, replaced by the soft crackling of embers, the last vestiges of a battle that had turned the canyon into a charred graveyard. But it wasn't over. He could hear the soft, uneven clopping of hooves behind him, the sound of Maria's horse making its way through the rocky ground. She was alive. She had survived. Somehow, against all odds, she had made it out of the hell they had been trapped in. He turned to see her, her face smudged with dirt, her clothes torn and singed from the flames. But her eyes, they were different now. Stronger. No longer the terrified girl who had been caged by Cole's cruelty. She had been freed, and, in the process, she had freed herself. "Jim," Maria said, her voice rough but steady. She wasn't afraid anymore. There was no more fear in her voice, only the sharp edge of survival. "It's over. He's gone. They're all gone." Jim didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her, his gaze steady and quiet. He hadn't expected her to make it. He hadn't expected to make it. But here they were, alive, against all the odds, standing in the ashes of everything that had come before. "We still got work to do," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "Still got to make sure Cole's men don't come back. Make sure the town's safe." Maria nodded, her face grim. "They won't be back. The fire took care of most of them, and the rest are scattered. They won't be able to regroup." Jim exhaled slowly, letting the air fill his lungs, as if the weight of the past could somehow leave him if he breathed deeply enough. But it didn't. It was still there, in the hollow of his chest, in the ache that settled in his bones. The death, the loss, the betrayal, it was all still fresh. And now, the only thing that was left was the road ahead. "I thought I could save her," he said, his voice soft, almost to himself. "I thought I could save Sarah." Maria's expression softened, her eyes filled with understanding. "You tried. But she made her choice, Jim. She was part of this long before you came along." The weight of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew it was true. He had seen the signs, felt the betrayal deep in his bones, but he hadn't wanted to believe it. Not about Sarah. Not about the woman he had thought could make him better. But the truth was undeniable now. She had been lost long before he had come into her life. And now, she was gone, a casualty of her own choices, of a world that had no place for redemption. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, as they both stood there, looking at the ashes of the camp, the fading remnants of the fire. Jim turned his gaze to the horizon. The sun was starting to rise, its light casting a pale glow over the canyon, turning the dark walls of rock into shades of gold and crimson. The storm of fire and violence had passed, but something else lingered in the air, something that Jim couldn't name. "It's not over, is it?" he asked quietly, more to himself than to Maria. She shook her head. "No, it's never over. Not for men like us." The truth of her words settled in his chest. The world they lived in didn't leave much room for peace, for rest. It was a world of endless conflict, of men and women trying to survive in a place that didn't care about them. A world where every fight led to another, where every victory came at a cost. But even in the darkest corners of the world, there was light. There was always a choice. "We've got a long road ahead of us," Jim said, his voice steady once again. He turned to face Maria, his hand resting on the rifle slung across his chest. "But I reckon we'll figure it out. One step at a time." Maria nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I reckon we will." With that, they turned and began walking toward their horses, the canyon now behind them. The fire had burned itself out, but the scars it left would remain. And though the past would never fully fade, Jim knew one thing for certain. He wasn't walking alone anymore. As they rode out of the canyon, the first light of dawn touching the horizon, Jim allowed himself to breathe a little easier. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir inside him, a small, quiet hope. In the Wild West, where the sun set every day on a world built on blood and dust, hope was a rare thing. But sometimes, even in the deepest of shadows, it could rise again. And as they rode into the rising sun, Jim knew that no matter where the road took them, they would face it together.